Okay, we are recording. I am Brandon Polite, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, and I'm joined by Nicholas Whittaker, who is a graduate student completing their PhD in philosophy at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. Nicholas, thank you so much for joining me.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited. This will be fun.
So am I. So we're talking about your awesome article towards a definition of Black cinematic horror, which came out in the journal Film and Philosophy this year, 2022. Um, and I love this paper. It's really fun, really fantastic, really deep. And just to get into it, I think, the most basic question is what's distinctive about Black cinematic horror, right? That distinguishes Black horror films from other types of horror.
Yeah, great. So essentially, the kind of distinction that matters isn't so much the kind of surface level distinction about, are there Black people in the movie? Is it made by Black people? I'm kind of uninterested in those questions, the kind of authenticity questions that care a lot about the identities of the creators or like the presence of certain, bodies in the film. Obviously, those questions are important for all sorts of ethical reasons, but they're not the definitional questions I'm interested in. Um, so like in my definition is pretty sweeping, right? So I'll include kind of paradigmatic movies like the Jordan Peele horror films, like the kind of blaxploitation era Black horror films, so films with amazing names like Blackenstein and Blackula. Um, I'll include movies like Beloved, but then I'll also include movies like Night of the Living Dead. And in fact, I'd include all three of Romero's original kind of zombie trilogy, right? Um, I'd include movies that like White Zombie, and I Walked with a Zombie, right? So these kind of early 30s horror films that occasionally do have Black figures in them, but for the most part are kind of haunted by this like off-screen presence of like Africanness or Blackness. So, and all that is to say that for me, the really relevant thing is when I'm watching this movie, is my conception of Blackness being shaped in a particular way, right? And my conception of whiteness, and my conception of kind of other racial categories. Um, and there are lots of cases of movies that do this, I think, that don't necessarily look as though, I mean, George Romero, right? So for viewers unfamiliar, Night of the Living Dead stars Dwayne Jones, a fantastic Black actor. And the film is in 1968. He plays this cool, suave, debonair, like in control hero who utterly, orders about the other white survivors who are locked with him in a farmhouse, trying to escape the zombies. In the end, he's the only one to survive survive the zombie invasion, and he emerges into the light of day. And spoiler alert, he's then shot in the head by the kind of redneck militia who are patrolling the area looking for zombies. And so they think he's a zombie, and so they shoot him. This is a kind of common trope now in horror, but like this is kind of one of the first times we saw like such a kind of like brutal twist of fate at the end. And the film ends with these still images of the character Ben's body being carried, stripped and carried about and then thrown into a fire, all very reminiscent of like lynching photography, right? That begs for a certain kind of interpretation, one that George Romero, to his grave, insisted was not at all his intention. He insisted that he cast the best actor for the part. He insisted that he never intended to make any kind of racial allegory. And I like believe that to be true. I see no reason to doubt, him. So the point is not about the presence of particular bodies on or off camera. It's not about the intentions of the artists. It's about the fact that it's pretty much impossible to watch Night of the Living Dead and not feel a particular kind of way about the Blackness depicted, right? That's what's important to me. And that's going to capture a lot of horror movies because, as like a lot of horror scholars have noted, race has long been a really, really essential trope within horror, right? You know, think of the trope of the shaman, the witch doctor, right? You know, the kind of wave of 80s and 90s like ghetto horror, movies like Leprechaun in the Hood, right? Um, you know, early 2000s Snoop Dogg horror movies, you know, movies where, you know, vampires are often kind of coded as you know, non-Western, I'll say, or in some sense foreign. So all of that to me, you know, including all of that in my definition is going to capture a lot, but I see no reason why that's a problem, because those give us a lot more resources for thinking about how horror has this particular vision of what blackness is and can be. And I see no reason to like jettison those resources for, you know, semantic squabbles.
Yeah, right. And one of the things that you talk about in the article is that often in the sort of films you're talking about, right, blackness is viewed as monstrous in some way, right? Is this monstrous other? And, you know, I've taught a class on monsters for a number of years. And, you know, but one thing that's distinctive about them is their hybridity, right? They're hybrids of living and dead, right? Or of animal and human, or of you know, having qualities of multiple genders, right? Or whatever, right? And so there's this mismatch or you know, mashup of categories, right? And you know, Noel Carroll talks about this as like category jamming, right? And so our horror in response to monsters or the monstrous is the fact that our concepts for understanding the world just don't work with this thing or this entity or this presence or whatever it is. And so could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and like as you know, that's kind of essential to the argument in the paper and to my just general vision of what black horror is doing, right? So I've said what makes black horror different from other horror films, and this is like the perfect place to kind of say what makes it different from other black films, right? Like what I think black horror is doing differently than films like Steve McQueen's fantastic, you know, films like 12 Years a Slave and the Small Axe series. Um, you know, films like, you know, any any Oprah Winfrey funded project. Right. What black horror does differently is really grab onto this sense of monstrosity as, you know, interstitiality, as category blurring. Right. So what's happening there on my view is, and you know, this is one of the reasons why I want such a broad sweeping definition, is because Night of the Living Dead is just such a perfect resource for talking about this. And that's, you know, you mentioned, you know, the blurring of categories of living and dead. And it's so important to recognize how, particularly in this middle period of zombie cinema, right? So in the early days, you know, in the tens to 30s kind of like wave of zombies, it's all rooted in like voodoo, right? And like shamanistic kind of like scaremongering, and this you know, this image of the scary witch doctor who can put you under the spell that will like, make you, you know, work as a slave for them, right? And that's the kind of anxiety there. And so the zombie is just this kind of, you know, bewitched figure, right? And nowadays our zombies are kind of these mistakes of science, right? They've become, you know, these viral creatures, right? So movies like 28 Days Later, World War Z, Train to Busan. I mean, these are all films, right, where zombies are very immediately explained by, you know, I mean, in Train to Busan, if I recall correctly, the explanation we get is we just see a kind of dead animal in a radioactive zone. And so the implication is that, right, these zombies are just some kind of radioactivity has made zombies. You know, it's all hand waving, but it's scientific hand waving. And what we get in this middle period, right, middle period that Night of the Living Dead essentially creates, is zombies as inexplainable, right? There's this one throwaway line in Night of the Living Dead that attempts to explain what might be going on, and a newscaster makes a remark about a comet that passed overhead, and, you know, suggests that scientists wonder if this could have caused, you know, the rise of the living dead. And what's great about that is it's so obviously a kind of empty explanation, like, oh, it was the comet. Okay. And it's not cashed out in like, it's neither cashed out in magical language or scientific language. And, to just do the kind of like maybe this table setting, right? If we can think of magic and science as these two different ways to give us these kind of robust explanations, right? To isolate patterns and explain how these patterns come to be, then what's really cool about the Night of the Living Dead era kind of zombie is that there's no attempt to use any of those robust explanations. And here's why: because those movies want you to really grasp the terror of this category blurring, right? So what happens when we get these two alternative explanations is that we call contemporary zombies living dead, but they're not really, right? They're just alive people who've been mentally warped by a virus, or they're the in the video game The Last of Us, right? The zombies there are like dead bodies that are animated by like a kind of sentient mushrooms that now grow within them, right? And ditto with the magic there, it's just very purely a living body or a dead body animated by the kind of like magic of some other agent, right? But what we get in Night of the Living Dead is, no, these beings are dead, but like they are also alive, right? And that sounds like that is a nonsensical, paradoxical utterance, and like, yeah, it's supposed to be, right? That's what horror is giving us, right? Access to these paradoxical utterances that don't work if you poke at them, right? But the point isn't to poke at them. The point is to let yourself be kind of carried away by the just the terror of the idea of, like, one of my kind of favorite examples I like to use, because it's such a simple one, is imagine you're like trying to start your car in the morning and it's not starting, and you spend all day like panicking and freaking out, and then eventually you get someone to tow it, and you realize that literally the battery was empty, right? Or something like that, right? Juxtapose that with the experience of waking up one morning, trying to start your car, taking it to mechanic after mechanic, and all of them saying, yeah, I don't know, this car is in literally perfect shape. That feels spooky, right? You already like there is this immediate sense of like, what's going on? It's not that there's a mystery to be solved, right? It's not that there's clearly some explanation you're not getting at yet. Like with the car cases, no, there's no explanation, there's no mystery here. It's just the case that your car won't start, right? And that's the kind of this thing should be this, but it's not, and there's no reason it's not, it's just not. That's like kind of the essence to me of like monsterization in horror, right? And so basically what we get with black horror, then I'll pause here, is just what if we think about blackness like that, right? Like, what if we try to think about blackness and anti-black violence and race itself, right? Which is a thing we've now all supposedly reached this understanding is like empty and false, and yet it continues to persist, right? Like, what if instead of crafting these tight and neat and correct social constructivist accounts of how clearly false things can nonetheless impact the world we live in, what if instead we kind of sat for a moment in that kind of terrifying feeling of this thing shouldn't be this way, but it is, right? That's what these black horror films are getting us access to.
Yeah, right. And in addition to being indefinable and inexplainable, it's also threatening, right? That the monstrous, right, violates all sorts of taboos with respect to food in particular, right? That the zombie eats us, the vampire eats us, the werewolf eats us, right? That we become food, and it's the threat and the fear is about our own embodiment, right? That our bodies could be food for something else. And do you think that figures in, right? And I mean, you can see that that with the early zombie movies from like the teens through 30s, right? You have interestingly, you have white people enslaved by a magical black figure, right? And so the anxiety seems to be about, oh, we could be slaves like they were slaves, right? And interestingly, then with how zombies, get refigured with Romero and subsequently, it's, oh, we could be food for these things, right? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's all exactly right, right? That like there has to be this essential difference between the kind of category blurring, the kind of fantasticality of horror. And, this is the example that Noel uses in his work, right? Between like horror and fantasy, right? Fantasy has category blurring all the time, and yet it's not grasped as horrific. And what I think is really cool about those kind of questions is how they reveal to us that the distinction is a matter of perspective, right? So think one of my favorite movies of the past year was The Northman, right? So Robert Eggers' The Northman. And I kind of grew up loving Viking movies. I'm a sucker for them. And I love a good medieval fantasy. And what that movie does so well is, rather than trying to depict this Viking fantasy, this kind of like mythic backdrop, this context of intelligibility that this kind of era has, from our position, right? Instead of depicting its gods as these like handsome blonde blue-eyed like figures, instead of depicting its Vikings as these heroic or like evil, right, figures. I think about one of my favorite scenes in the movie is this. Sorry that I'm now ranting about the Northmen. There's this great scene, this great battle scene where one of the Viking ships kind of attacks this town, and not only is it gratuitously bloody, right, which you would expect, but what's so great about it is it really captures the fact that this historical event is a group of random guys in deer skins, like jumping out of the woods and climbing up walls of this town that's never experienced anything like this before, right? It has this sense of like, this is weird for them, right? It's odd and it's horrifying and it doesn't make sense, right? We think of this historical narrative as pat and neat because it's a historical narrative to us, right? But and so there's the point here is think about the ways in which we now talk about like the monsters of Greek myth, right, or Viking myth, right, where we have little action figures of these entities now, right, like I've seen like plush like cyclopses, like little like beanie baby cyclopses. There's this sense of like, oh, we know what this is, everyone knows what this is, right? And that misses the fact that at the historical moment, right, that's not what this is. That's not what these kind of narratives are doing, right? They're depicting something that feels alien and foreign, not local and homegrown. And so I just think that it's important that like we see that the way in which horror has the sense of threat, right, it comes from the foreignness, right? It is about physical danger, right? But so are action movies, right? And so are dramas, right? My the most important distinction I use, right, in this kind of work is the distinction between movies about slavery and Black horror movies, right? Both are depicting like grotesque violence, and both are depicting like great threat, right? But only one of those, I think, is really grasping the fact that this violence is in part violent because it feels so alien and mysterious and impossible to capture and define, right? Like the best narratives of American chattel slavery, right, are those that really embrace the fact that these people who suffered this had no idea what was going on, right? And when they're loaded onto these ships, there's not this sense of, yes, like here I am about to undergo the Middle Passage, right? Like the historical narrative that we use to make sense of it now is not something they had access to, right? And thinking about reconfiguring the threat of anti-Blackness in that sense, right, as a threat that's really essentially a mysterious one, that's kind of at the heart of Black horror, right?
Yeah, awesome. And so one thing that you say at the very end of the paper, which I think is really interesting, right, relates to exactly what you were just talking about, sort of the issue of what's called in the discourse trauma porn, right? That there's a real question as to whether artists should be depicting Black suffering and whether we as audiences should be getting pleasure from depictions of Black suffering in cinema and, you know, other media. So what are your thoughts on that, right? You sort of leave that as an open question at the end. And so now I want you to give us an answer.
I'm pinned down. I have nowhere to run. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so the first thing I'll say is that I think it's really worth noting that, you know, this is not the first time we've gotten this kind of like discourse about trauma porn. Of course, it's been a part of like kind of politics and theory for a long time now. But the recent iteration, right, the kind of like post Trump iteration, right? Let's just call it what it is, of this kind of like this kind of I don't know, soapbox. Um it starts, as far as I can kind of track as someone who lived through this, with you know, the 2015 release of the movie Moonlight, right? So after Barry Jenkins' Moonlight and after its Oscar wins, right? I just, there was this upsurge of discourse about like, you know, finally we get to see like a Black movie win that's not about slavery, right? And finally we get to see like, you know, I remember like Black Boy, hashtag Black Boy Joy, right, being like a kind of like reiterated slogan in the wake of this movie. And I just remember at the time kind of being a little confused because for those of y'all who've seen Moonlight, it's not a happy movie. It's a profoundly sad movie and one profoundly steeped in like a kind of existential terror, right? It obviously has beauty to it. And in a sense, it gives us what, yes, 100%, Black cinema doesn't often, or historically hasn't often given us, which is like this happy ending, right? To call it pat, but even that's too pat, right? I mean, the happy ending of that film is these two, you know, lovers together in each other's arms, and any, you know, other movie of sophistication, of which Moonlight is, will like make it very clear that that's not necessarily a happy ending, right? Like, you know, the fact that, you know, two people end up together in the end, that's just, it's a human ending, right? It's one of the many possibilities that human stories can end. And that's not to say that, you know, when the camera cuts off, all of a sudden these two characters are gonna, you know, hate each other and go at it, but they're going to try to build a life together. And like always, that life is going to be like filled with trials and tribulations, right? The same trials and tribulations that had been like an essential part of the film. So I start with yet another tangent to like say that I think it's really important to like recognize that that's what's at the that's the origin point of this current wave of like anti-trauma porn discourse, right? Not just this kind of like reiteration of, you know, black boy joy, of, you know, we want to see like Black stories of joy and pleasure, but a particular misreading of the kind of like, you know, foundational text that, you know, this slogan was using, right? A kind of like simplifying of the very thing it was using as its kind of standard. And I think that's at the essence of I think that's at the heart of like contemporary trauma porn discourse. Like I think what's happening is that we're doing this really weird we're making this really weird demand for simplicity, and the simplicity of both joy and terror. I mean, so one of the examples I kind of suggest in my paper is not a horror film, although like that was kind of like journal prepping hand waving, and at my core I actually do think it's a horror film, right? And that's Fellini's Juliet of the Spirits, and most of Fellini's surrealist films, right? I want to call a lot of films that seem like these gorgeous kind of surreal, I mean, David Lynch being the kind of like obvious, right, kind of case of this, right? Juliet of the Spirits is this like really deep and loving and kind and sweet film that has this like deep undertone of darkness to it, right? So is every single one of David Lynch's movies, like famously, right? And what I think is frustrating to me is that Black art at its best is precisely capturing this double this interplay, right? From the blues on, right? There's this sense of where beauty is, pain is also, and vice versa. And so what I find frustrating about the kind of like anti-trauma porn, even what I find frustrating about the trauma porn category, is that it's often not capturing the things it's supposed to capture, right? and it's often misdiagnosing what's actually at stake here. So I have this review essay I wrote for a magazine, The Point, where I kind of sweepingly trash, I guess, is to be very honest with myself. One of the more recent prestige black horror enterprises, which was Amazon Prime's television show Them, right? Specifically the first season. And they at the when it first came out, I just remember the headlines of all the kind of pans of the piece saying, like, this is trauma porn, this is grotesque, this is just such a violent depiction of black suffering, so much more so than it should be. And then I watched it, and like, I was disappointed at the lack of gratuity and the lack of grotesquerie, right? Here I am coming from, and this is like the example I use in the essay. Here I am coming from like Lucio Fulci movies, right? And like Mario Bava movies and Dario Argento movies. And I know I just listed 3 Italian sickos, but like David Lynch movies, right? And Romero movies. And like, Jennifer Kent movies. I don't know. And just all these films where I mean, Rusty Cundiff movies, right? To mention like the director of Tales Tales from the Hood, right? These movies where, violence is depicted and it is depicted. And this movie, the television show Them, did everything it could to avoid showing you actual violence. And instead, what it showed you is like shot after shot of white people saying the N-word, right? It really fixated on these like political evils, right? And flagellated them, often by overly depicting like the white folks, right? And them saying terrible things and like believing terrible things. But it showed so little actual black people suffering, which again, that's not even yet addressing the question of like, is it morally good to watch black people suffering? I just think it's so important to note that like the debate over trauma porn is like a debate over like an empty category, right? It's not capturing, like, if you want to debate trauma porn, like debate like movies like I Spit on Your Grave, right? Or debate movies like, I don't know, like The Fly, for God's sakes, right? The Cronenberg one, obviously, right? Debate things like Blackula and Ganja and Hess, right? Or Tales from the Hood, right? Debate movies like that. Ones that debate movies like Night and Fog, right? The kind of Holocaust film that shows some of the like grotesque imagery I've ever seen on a film camera. Not movies like Moonlight versus Them, right? Neither of which capture the thing you're actually interested in. So that's my first kind of frustration. And I've been talking for a while, so maybe I can pause here, but I'll just say very quickly then. And what I'm interested in is horror then not only is black horror an opportunity to actually depict black suffering, right, in an aesthetically meaningful way, in a way that we actually don't typically get access to, even in the films that purport to be capturing, black suffering, right? And if it is, are they doing it in a better? If horror is doing this, is it doing this in a better way? And I think it is. I think it's doing it in a way that is not only like morally good, but like really aesthetically good. And I think those are both really relevant and important.
Yeah, because I mean, relevant to the horror genre is depictions of gratuitous violence and suffering, right? Regardless of, the race issue, right? And so, you would expect from black horror, precisely the sort of things that are typical of the genre, right? Namely, gratuitous violence and suffering, right? And extended shots of gratuitous violence and suffering, not just, off camera hidden away, although there will be some of that, but yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so I part of what I would kind of suggest to anyone watching who is now angry at what I've said, is to like ask why it's the case that if you're on board with the kind of like anti-trauma porn critique that I've sketched, why you want a black horror film at all, right? And I think Brandon, like the point is, you've just communicated this so well, right? Like, what are you going to horror for? because I'll be very clear what I go to horror movies for. I go to them to see like eyeballs get lanced, right? I go to them to see, to make a list of body counts in every Halloween film, right? To make sure I know which ones murdered the most innocent teens, right? And I watch Argento movies to see which of the incredibly extended, incredibly grotesque kill sequences is my favorite one, right? And maybe I'm psychopathic for that, but we don't typically actually think that people who watch horror movies for this reason are psychopathic, right? Those of us who don't like horror, sure, we may feel like we're sick to our stomach when we see our friends like loudly cheering as Michael Myers slaughters yet another teen, but we don't then, call the mental ward on our friends. We know that there's a good reason for them to be doing what they do. And so what I guess I'm curious about is why that reason seems to go out the window when we're talking about Black horror, right? Because, and kind of this is, I guess, like if I have a slogan today, like it's this, it's, that's what we go to. That's the exciting thing that Black horror has to offer, both aesthetically and politically, right? Like it is because horror is doing this specific, grotesque, gratuitous thing that Black horror is so exciting, right? And I think it's just worth like noting that what the newest crop of, prestige, schlocky, clean, non-trauma porn horror movies give us is like not what most other horror movies give us. And the latter is what I think is most exciting and generative, like really politically generative, right? And what I can say, like to start talking about that, I guess that last bit, because that's still I'm still refusing to be pinned down and say exactly why I think this violence is good. So let me stop hiding. What I think is important is that any kind of anti-trauma porn like party line can't say that suffering shouldn't move us emotionally at all, right? Like, no one who's hopefully saying we want no more trauma porn is saying we want no more talking about the anti-Black violence, right? Because that's obviously a different party line, right? That's an anti-CRT party line, right? That's an anti-education party line. And so ostensibly the trauma porn, resistor agrees with that, at least, that we need to talk about and we need to emotionally engage with anti-Black suffering or anti-Black violence and Black suffering, right? And so then the question worth posing is like, okay, so what is the right way to do it, right? And for me, what I'm interested in is two things, right? A, what's the right emotionality around that experience, right? Like, how do we feel in the right way about anti-Black violence and Black suffering, right? And then what do we do about it, right? Like, it's really important that we then move on from, our feelings to like political action. And so I guess to sketch like what a good account of how to healthily consume Black suffering would require is it requires you to say, what's the desirable affect or emotion, and how does that emotion or affect inspire you to the right kinds of actions, right? That's what we want from experiencing any kind of that's what moral behavior needs, right? A motivating affect that drives you to the right activity. And basically what I think is that the experience of Black horror, the emotion that Black horror films like evoke in you is the emotion that's going to do that, right? It's the one that's going to set you up in this right kind of affective orientation that's then going to prompt you towards the right kind of political action. And the reason that I think that is what we've said so far, the sense of mystery, or even better, the sense of impossibility to comprehend, right? That's what I think is lost in our anti-trauma porn kind of party line, right? What we get when we have this party line is depictions of Black suffering that promise you know exactly what it is and why it's bad, that attempts to constrain it within very intelligible and very easy to comprehend scripts, and categories and conceptual kind of landscapes, right? And if this sounds too abstract, like this is what anti-racist workshops do, right? This is anti-racism 101, right? This is Ramen D'Angelo 101. This is, learn, this is who you are, this is what you do, this is what's bad, this is what you have to do to fix it, right? It tells you this is you now you know what to do, right? You've read my book and now you know how to be an anti-racist, right? And I think that's really dangerous. And that's the complete wrong way to go about doing like productive political activity. And it's coming from a bad emotional kind of orientation. That's like one I would want to call something like smugness or arrogance or self-assuredness. And what horror gives you is the kind of complete opposite, right? It's the sense that something's evil and bad, but a profound sense of incomprehension about it. A profound sense of this thing being bigger than you, right? And beyond your capabilities to comprehend. But importantly, not beyond your abilities to do something about, right? Like Laurie Strode doesn't comprehend Michael Myers in the Halloween movies. She has no idea why he does what he does. She's constantly sobbing about it, but she knows to run away when he comes close, right? And I think there's something really important here, right? I think the Laurie Strode case like illustrates what I think horror as a depiction of Black suffering allows us to do, right? Rather than getting us fixated on this sense of surety, of epistemic, like I know what's going on here. Epistemic, I know what's going on here. It's a great category. It pushes you to see the evil, to feel it's evil, and to do something about it. Right. And it reveals that the sense of surety is not just like not necessary for that, but works against it. So that's why I think it's morally okay to watch Black horror movies.
Awesome. Cool. And I mean, I think a lot of what you're saying there sort of relates to what we were talking about before we started recording, which has to do with, the distinction between elevated horror and I guess low horror, right? Or exploitation horror. I mean, I don't know if that's the best word for that. And I think part of what you were talking about earlier, right, is that elevated horror seems more didactic, or at least it gives you clear concepts, clear categories, whereas the low stuff often just like, nah, here's a bad guy, or here's a bad thing, or here's a monster, or here's some unknowable thing, and it's going to kill people, and you better run, right? So do you want to talk briefly about that distinction between elevated and low horror as it relates to Black horror films?
Definitely, right? So yeah, essentially what I think is going on, and I'm not the only, we know people who are writing about this low versus elevated distinction, and people are doing really great work about it. I'm thinking of like Matt Stroll, obviously, whose recent book on bad movies is fantastic. But so I guess here's my kind of like similar take on it. Low horror movies are movies that don't care about respectability. And what that means is not some abstract, like, they'll flip a middle finger to the man. It's that they literally know they're not going to win an Oscar, right? They know they're going to make a shit ton of money, but not a shit ton of money in the way a Marvel movie is going to make some, they know they know their ambitions, and they know that their ambitions, their aesthetic ambitions, kind of have to be distinct from the aesthetic ambitions of someone who's making a movie because they think it could win them an Oscar, right? And what happens, and I think, and this isn't like necessarily the case, but it's just happened to be the case with a lot of the exploitation horror movies, right? Is you get directors and other creators, right, who are interested in doing new things, right, who are interested in doing something different, who are recognizing that if there is a particular formula for a movie that wins an Oscar, right, and this is, there's been plenty of ink spilled and jokes made about the kind of similarity of Oscar winning pictures, right? So if you don't have to follow that script, right, as a filmmaker, then like the world is your oyster. You can make whatever insane movie. You can make a movie, called Blackula, about a 17th century or an 18th century African prince who discovers that Dracula's a racist, yells at him for it. Dracula gets pissed, bites him, turns him into a vampire, locks him up for centuries in a coffin that is then opened by a couple who is moving into the castle because it's the hot new thing to do in the 70s, and then is let loose on San Francisco. I think it's San Francisco, it might be LA. But right, like, and it's so this Blackula, right? You've got Mamuwalde is Blackula himself, and you've got him. Oh, and by the way, Blackula is not just the title of the film. Dracula says upon turning Mamuwalde into a vampire something to the effect of I dub thee Blackula, right? And he says it with this sneer, and he's like, ha, and it's amazing. And then what you get in the movie is Mamuwalde wearing this sweeping Dracula cloak, right, striding across the California city landscape, running into 70s Black Power figures and Blaxploitation like kind of caricatures, and beefing with the cops, and just having this completely insane, implausible. I mean, so the actor who plays Mamuwalde is a Shakespearean trained actor, right? And he plays the thing completely straight, right? Like he plays it with this like high theater energy for a movie that just does not deserve it, and it's amazing, right? That's not a thing you could ever like imagine if Amazon Prime right now bankrolled a Blackula remake. I mean, we don't have to imagine it, we've seen it, right? With the myriad of remakes of I actually quite like the most recent Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake. So those ones, they're safe in the chopping block of my disdain. But we're constantly seeing kind of these rebooted cult classics, the kind of abysmal Rocky Horror Picture Show kind of reboot from a few years ago, stuff like that, right? This like taking of these exploitation B movie films and thinking that, well, if you pump millions more dollars into it, and if you clean it up, and if you run it through quality control and focus groups, you'll still have the essence of the film, and you won't. Like what's good about the film is gone now, right? This sense of anarchism, right? This sense of this is genuinely something I have yet to have seen before, right? And it's something that not only have I not seen, but I know I'm like kind of not allowed to see, right? And that is a really nice segue to what's relevant for how this is relevant to talking about Black horror. So the theorist Michael Gillespie has this fantastic book called Film Blackness, where he essentially kind of makes I'm really indebted to him, and the book kind of sets the foundation for what I kind of want to do here. And what Gillespie says is, look, when we think about the concept of Black cinema, usually we end up doing like this weird kind of racial essentializing thing, right? We think of these movies that not just like we're thinking of these movies that fit a particular ideological narrative of like what Blackness is, right? Black cinema is slave movies and ghetto movies, right? And what he says is not, but like there's so many other cool kinds of movies, right? Like what about a Black Western, right? We just had what I thought was an abysmal Black Western by Netflix a couple years ago, right? Or last year, I think. The Harder They Fall, right? It's not that just, Gillespie saying, well, we need to make like more diverse Black movies of the same kind of tenor. What he says is, look, Black creators can play with Blackness, right? This is art. This is artifice. This is something they're doing an experiment. They're in a laboratory making something fictional and weird. And Blackness can be that for them. And in fact, really beautifully is for a lot of Black creators, right? Not Blackness is, like so many other things in life, like the fodder for interesting artistic experimentation. And what he wants is a concept of Black cinema that, instead of defining it as like cinema that communicates X ideological view of like or concept of Black people, it's films where Blackness is played with and played around with, right? So elevated Black horror films, in my mind, are precisely the Black horror films that don't play around with Blackness, right? They don't experiment with it. And because of that, they're not able to access this sense of blackness we've been talking about, right? And anti-blackness as this monstrous thing, right? As this uncanny thing, this thing beyond the bounds of intelligibility, right? Instead, you have Black horror films where that follows a script, and not just, a formulaic script, because exploitation movies will follow, slasher movies all have like a pretty robust script, but a political and conceptual script, right? Like, you start watching a Black horror film made now, 9 times out of 10 you know exactly how it's going to end, and you know what political message you're supposed to walk away with. You know exactly what you're supposed to think of the Black characters. You're supposed to, cheer for the Black people and boo the white people. You're supposed to, just expect this moment of like, racial reckoning where, the Black person is re-empowered and gets to destroy the white person once and for all, the white villain or monster once and for all, right? I just saw, to continue to point fingers and be mean, I just saw the film Barbarian, the new horror film on Hulu, and it felt exactly like this to me. And I was profoundly disappointed by it because, again, I didn't just know how the movie was going to end in this plot sense. That's often a very exciting feeling, but I knew precisely what political message I was supposed to walk away with, and that's boring. And for the reasons I was discussing just before, is like also I think politically bad, because it creates this sense of smugness and arrogance that's bad for good politics. But so basically then, yeah, I think the low Black horror movies are the ones where blackness, because they're the movies where blackness is monstrous, it creates this opportunity to play around with it, right? It creates this opportunity to experiment with it and try different things and be like curious, right, about the possibilities of Black representation, instead of being uncurious, right, and locked in. And there's so, and I'll stop here. There's just lots of other like good work on elevated horror that like kind of critiques its like its high production value and its like lack of grotesquerie, and it's kind of like bad writing, right? There's and all those are true, right? But for me, the thing that's really relevant is this sense of didacticism, right? This sense of being lectured to, not because it's bad to be lectured to, but it's because it's bad for this particular political kind of like crisis, to cultivate this sense of arrogance that lecturing kind of can, that didacticism can give both the lecturer and the person who's lectured to.
Yeah, I think we'll end it there, but I really like the idea that the monster is essentially free from societal norms and rules, right? They're not bound and don't view themselves as bound by those norms and rules. And so it's precisely a place of freedom where you can sort of, the possibility to create and recreate and reimagine and re-envision particular forms of identity, whether it has to do with gender or race or sexuality and so forth. And so, yeah, that more films and more works of fiction that are able to play around in that space, that seems like a good thing to me. So Nicholas, thank you so much for joining me. This was a really fun discussion and one that I've been looking forward to for a while. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was a blast. Yeah, just thanks.
Awesome.